Growing up, I always felt like my family was a bit different, and specifically my dad. I wondered why my dad seemed so different than all the other dads. He'd talk about strange and inappropriate things in social situations. He was completely irrational sometimes, and he'd often have really intense reactions. It wasn't until much later, decades later, that I realized that those were actually hidden signs of autism. Now I'm 40, and as an adult, I realized that those behaviors, they weren't personal. They were simply symptoms of a condition that go undiagnosed in adults, specifically adults of a certain generation. But the thing is, just because they're undiagnosed doesn't mean that it doesn't affect a family deeply. It causes miscommunication within the family. It causes disruption. There's no routine. There are communication problems. And it can create a sense of insecurity and lack of confidence within every single member of that family. So here are some common signs that your dad might be on the autism spectrum, but he was completely undiagnosed. Sign number 1, social communication challenges. By the way, all these signs are taken from the DSM-5 autistic diagnosis criteria. But these are just my way of using words that make sense to you and me instead of medical terminology. So this looks like difficulty understanding social cues, maintaining eye contact, or engaging in meaningful conversations. So basically, your dad was a bit weird when it came to his communication style. Maybe he was that awkward person at school gatherings when there were other parents around, or he just refused to go altogether because it was just too much for him. Or maybe when there was a sports event that you went to, maybe you played sports and he was there, but he was always the quiet, reserved one. And you asked yourself, why is my dad the uncool one? Why isn't he as cool as the other dads? Another sign of communication issues is facial expressions and the tone of voice that he might have used. He might have always appeared grumpy or had that resting bitch face like Kanye West. So it was impossible for you to tell whether he's happy with you or disappointed with you. And the same with his voice. He may have had this monotone voice that made it really difficult to tell whether he's being sarcastic or if he's happy or if he's angry. Sign number 2, again from the DSM-5, is repetitive behaviors. Engaging in repetitive action, routines, or interests. He had his way and it always had to be his way. For example, maybe he always had to eat the same thing every Tuesday. I don't know, Taco Tuesdays. Or he always had to go running on the exact same trail every Sunday. Or he made the entire family go to the exact same restaurant every Friday for family dinner. He loved his sameness. He loved his routines. Sign number 3, sensory sensitivities. Over or under sensitivity to sound, touch, or even light. For example, maybe he was so particular about sounds. If you were sniffling like all the time, he would just freak out and make you blow your nose like 100 times that day. Even if you have a cold, he didn't care. The sound just drove him nuts and he had to control that. And maybe the lighting in the house had to be just right. So always kind of dark, always extra bright, so he felt like, it was his way. By the way, I'll say this now so I don't forget. If you're finding this video helpful, please give it a like because it helps it to reach other people who might also benefit from this content. Sign number 4, limited interests. For example, maybe he was obsessed about that one particular thing that nobody else in the world cares about. For example, Japanese swords, and he had a collection of them and he knew everything about them. And here, another point I'm going to talk about later, which is theory of mind, comes into play. Maybe because of his special interest was so narrow, he had no room or respect for your special interests and made you feel like your interest means nothing, they're inferior, and it made him appear arrogant and condescending. Sign number 5, difficulty with change. He was extremely resistant to change. If something changed in your family, he would absolutely freak out almost have a meltdown. For example, if he had lost his job, or if he had taken a new job, or if you had to move apartments, or you got a new car, but he hadn't really wanted to get a new car, he would actually have an absolute meltdown. And it may have been really scary and disorienting for you to witness an adult, specifically your dad, like who's supposed to be the one who has this ish together, takes care of you, losing their marbles in that moment and absolutely behaving like a child having a tantrum. Again, I have to stop and say, if you're feeling like some of these points are hitting the mark with your dad, but not quite, then it's possible that he has ADHD in addition to being on the autism spectrum. And what that feels like, what that looks like, I made a whole other video about that, which you can watch here. What it's like to have ADHD and autism. Sign number 6, challenges with executive functioning. This looks like difficulties with time management, planning, and organization. If they had autistic inertia, that means they had such a hard time starting something. And maybe they were an over planner and they wanted to just have every single detail planned and known in advance before agreeing to start any new activity or any new project with you. So for example, maybe he promised that he would build you an epic treehouse or a giant Lego tower or a pillow fort. But then when he started, he realized how many steps are involved and how complicated it might be. And he got overwhelmed and completely gave up. And that made you feel like, oh, my dad promised something, but then he let me down. Sign number 7, theory of mind. I have another video about this also, but I'll explain here how it might connect to your dad being on the spectrum. He had a hard time understanding other people's thoughts, experiences, and perspectives. He may have felt like what he's feeling is how everybody else feels, and what he's thinking is how everybody else thinks. For example, maybe he was super excited about going to the same vacation rental the 5th year in a row, and he just wouldn't understand why you find that absolutely boring and you just don't want to. Or if he got angry with you about something you did, he wouldn't be able to take himself out of the situation, put himself in your shoes, and try to understand why you may have done that thing you did. So this is a problem maybe in your teenage years that you might have had. And he just wouldn't try to understand that, or remember that, as a teenager, he may have also wanted to do some things like that, like break some rules or have some adventures. He just can't he can't imagine why you would be thinking differently to how he thinks. If you're resonating with some of these points, maybe you also have similar tendencies. Like not only are you realizing, oh, my dad is on the spectrum, but maybe you're realizing, oh my goodness, maybe I also share some of these traits and tendencies. And once you realize that you and your dad, yes, there are things you don't like about him, but maybe you're very similar. Maybe you have more in common than you realize. And once you see that, maybe you'll make different choices when it comes to parenting your kids. But do that consciously, knowing your traits, knowing your personality without being controlled by your past, your own childhood experience of growing up in difficult situations with neurodiverse parents. And I'm talking about this because this is my life. I realized that I'm on the autism spectrum, that I'm autistic only last year. I was 39 years old. And I only realized that because my son was diagnosed, who's now about to turn 6. After I realized that, I realized, oh my goodness, my dad is also autistic. And it put so many of the question marks from my childhood in its place. It gave me clarity, it gave me understanding, it gave me peace when it comes to my relationship with my dad. And that's what this channel is all about. This channel is about being the best parent that you could be, even with autism, even with ADHD, even with mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. If that's important to you, please subscribe to this channel. Okay, back to the list. Number 8, literal interpretation. That means taking people literally, not understanding rhetoric, not understanding sarcasm, and misunderstanding humor. For example, he may not have understood a simple joke you made when you were younger, and it made him get super angry and rage at you just because he didn't understand the sarcasm. Or he took a rhetorical question really seriously and started explaining to you, over explaining it to you, and got too serious about it. By the way, do you think your dad might be autistic? I'd love to hear your story, so put that in the comments below of any memories that come to you that, oh my god, that thing that he had done, now I see it's such a clear example of somebody being on the autism spectrum. You sharing your stories also helps other people who come along and they realize, they get that feeling that, oh, I'm not alone. Other people have had such experiences as well, specifically growing up. So please share your stories in the comment below. Sign number 9, anxiety and sensory overload. Meaning your dad would often get overstimulated and that would lead him to having a meltdown or becoming super anxious. Keyword here, meltdown. And this can look like violent rage where he's running around the house, smashing things in the house, breaking stuff. And I'm not excusing domestic violence here at all, but I'm just acknowledging that meltdowns can look really, really scary, specifically when you're a small kid watching or witnessing a parent do that or have a meltdown. From my research of reading other people's experiences of witnessing their parents having meltdowns, me having meltdowns in front of my kids, and also remembering situations where other autistic or neurodivergent people have had meltdowns within my family and friends circle and network, often, most of the time, that rage or that violence is directed at inanimate things. So like things in the house, they might break a door or punch a hole through the wall, and usually they will avoid hurting another human being or another animal, but they might start to hit themselves. So they might like hit their leg, do this gorilla move on their chest, or hit their head. I have another video about how I have behaved in meltdowns where that violence was directed at me, and I know that watching something like that is really scary for my kids, and I try to explain to them afterwards that, look, I was in a meltdown, and I try to help them make sense of the situation, take away the fear or the traumatic imprint from having witnessed that. But I have another whole video explaining what meltdowns look like in men and women. I highly recommend you watch that. I'm going to link to it right here. Finally, sign number 10, unique strength. This might look like strong visual thinking. So your dad might have always needed to draw diagrams in order to explain something to you. He thinks in pictures, or he may have ridiculously high attention to detail where everything has to be perfect, and if it wasn't, it just wasn't right, and it was not up to his standards, and that made you feel like any attempt you made was inferior. It gave you this feeling that no matter what you did, you weren't good enough for him. And again, special interests. His special interests or hyper focus might have been so narrow that it made you feel like anything you might be interested in just didn't matter. He actually just didn't even see anything past his own interests, so your interests, your likes, dislikes didn't really matter, and that might have made you feel invisible or neglected. Two very important things here. Please, 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 after watching this video, if you feel like, oh, my dad is autistic, I see it now, please don't go tell him, oh, Dad, by the way, I think you're autistic. I made this mistake and it's actually disrespectful. I realized that only in hindsight. Learning about yourself being on the autism spectrum, being autistic, or even ADHD is such a personal thing. It's such a personal experience, and somebody kind of imposing that diagnosis on you can be extremely infuriating. I made this mistake with my own dad, and I also made a video about that, and that's actually the first video that got a lot of views on my channel because the whole thing, it went down like, basically it was a crash and burn. I shouldn't have said that to him at all. You can just go watch that video and you'll see what I mean. Secondly, I need you to know that I'm not excusing any negative or violent behavior. And many of these things, even though they may have happened because of, autism playing a factor in it, I'm not saying that just because autism is involved, it didn't cause you childhood trauma. Many of these things lead to legitimate childhood trauma. My hope is that from watching this, you simply have more understanding into why your dad might have done some of the things he did when you were growing up. And maybe you realize that you also have similar tendencies. And maybe you're also on the autism spectrum. But that doesn't mean that you can't be a great parent, because you now have the awareness into yourself. And with that, you can make different choices when it comes to your parenting. And maybe once you realize that, you're going to make different choices when it comes to parenting your own kids. After watching all this, if you think that your dad is not actually autistic, but it's something else, it could be ADHD. And I made a whole other video about that, which you can watch right here.